Hello. In this video, we will be going over a version of Descartes' conceivability argument. So, towards the end of the meditations, in the sixth meditation actually, after Descartes has established his skeptical hypotheses and has established that he is a thinking thing via the cogito argument, Descartes presents what many called his conceivability argument. And so he says, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, insofar as I am simply a thinking thing, non-extended thing, that is a mind, and on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body, insofar as this is simply an extended non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. Now, what Descartes is trying to do here is he establishes or claims that he could conceive of an entity that is purely non-extended, meaning purely non-physical, namely a mind. And he also has a clear idea. He conceive of what it is for a body to be extended, meaning extended through space, a physical object. And because these two ideas are such that they're fundamentally different, or at least the substances that these ideas represent. From this, Descartes establishes that it has to be the case that the mind and the body are distinct entities. In other words, the mind and the body are not necessarily the same entity, or I should say, the brain and the mind are not necessarily the same entity. We can present a formal version of this argument with three premises. So we could say, premise one, whatever is clearly conceivable is possible. So we start off with that stipulation. Then Descartes would claim something along the lines of, it is conceivable to have mental states, let's say ideas and so on, ideas, feelings, and so on, without correlating brain states, meaning all of that brain activity that is correlated with those brain states. So therefore, if it's conceivable to have mental states without brain states, then from premise one, it follows that it has to be possible to have mental states without correlating brain states. Therefore, if it is possible to have mental states without correlating brain states, then it has to be the case that it's not necessarily true that brain states are identical to mental states. In other words, it is false that mental states are nothing more than brain states. So this is kind of a more contemporary formal version of Descartes' conceivability argument. Now, perhaps you are looking at the conclusion of this argument and saying, well, maybe there's something funny that's going on here. Yes, I'm kind of looking at the structure of the argument, and the argument seems to be valid, but I'm not sure if I necessarily buy the conclusion. So what gives? Well, remember, if we want to try to analyze or criticize Descartes' argument, we have to go back and look at the three ways that we have at our disposal for dealing with an argument. So there are three ways of dealing with any argument. The first is, well, you accept the conclusion, but we're stipulating that there's something funny about this conclusion. So the only other two options that we have is either to prove that the argument is invalid or show that at least an individual premise is false or could be false. Now, in this case, say for the sake, structurally, it looks like the argument is valid, although we could come back and revisit that later. But what I want to focus on instead is our third option. Try to show that one of the premises is false or could be false. And the premise that I want to focus on is premise number two, because this is the premise that actually holds a lot of weight. While we can accept that whatever is clearly conceivable is possible, it may not be at first glance evident that we can actually conceive of having a mind without a brain or individual mental states without correlating brain states. Now, obviously, Descartes believes that this is the case because this is what his entire, well, not just the conceivability argument is based off of, but his cogito argument is based off of. If you recall, he can, in light of the possibility of an evil genius trying to systematically deceive him, he thinks that, well, obviously I can't even be sure that I have a body that includes a brain, but what I can be sure of is that I exist, and I would have to exist as a thinking thing, and that seems clear to me. So that's where the basis of Descartes' conceivability argument, and so we try to represent that this way in premise two. So I want to focus on premise two. So all I can really say about premise two is that perhaps you are one who again, you don't think that you're not necessarily satisfied with the conclusion of the conceivability argument. And we're trying to see perhaps what is wrong with this. And at least at first glance, it looks like the argument is valid. So we're trying then to identify a premise that can be problematic. And perhaps the problematic premise is premise two. And ultimately, I think that what premise two is going to lie on is really this strong intuition that you either have or you don't have, that mental states are conceivable without correlating brain states. And while it may be clear to Descartes that this is the case, right, because obviously Descartes is operating under kind of this first person perspective when he's giving this argument, right? He's like, look, I can conceive of this, right? Therefore, it seems possible. It may not be the case that we can all conceive it. Maybe we lack the imagination, or maybe Descartes is just really stretching his imagination to an extent that we really can't do that. So if that's the case, then it really, it's not the strongest argument against premise two, or to try to demonstrate that premise two is false, but at least gives us some ground to leverage a possible criticism against this version of the conceivability argument. Now, with that said, it's not as though the conceivability argument just falls by the wayside, right? Obviously, someone as smart as Descartes, or even descendants of Descartes, contemporary Cartesians, have actually come and tried to kind of revamp a version of the conceivability argument. And most notably, you can attribute a form of dualism or Cartesian dualism to contemporary philosopher David Chalmers. And what David Chalmers focuses on when it comes to this argument is actually kind of the structure of how we are trying to think of the conceivability argument in terms of which aspect we are focusing on when we're trying to see whether we conceive of that aspect existing without the other one. In Descartes' version, we're trying to conceive of mental states without correlating brain states, but perhaps we would do better, right? Maybe we don't buy this. Like, I can't really conceive of, say, having a belief without a brain. Like, what does a belief without a brain look like? That's really hard to imagine. But if we reverse these, right, maybe we can provide a more robust presentation of the conceivability argument. So perhaps we are unable to conceive of mental states without brain states, but are we able to conceive of brain states without mental states? In other words, can we conceive of a being, right, that is molecularly identical to the way that we are and has all the corresponding physiology, all the corresponding neural activity, right? So every time, for example, this being touches a hot stove, they get signals to the central nervous system that are processed in various different parts of the brain, and then you have C fibers firing that would ultimately lead to a kind of first-person sensation of pain. But what we are asking is, can we have all of that without the sensation of pain? Can we have an individual that when we look at their physiology, they exhibit all of those qualities that any other person would exhibit when, say, they touch that hot stove, except for the fact that there isn't going to be an internal mental state of actual pain. Now, Chalmers is of the opinion that, in fact, yes, we can conceive of these, and he calls these philosophical zombies, right? But note, whether or not we buy that case, what I want you to note in this particular argument is that this argument is some sense structurally similar to Descartes' previous version of the conceivability argument. But now, this may allow us to actually be able to think of a situation in which we can conceive of an entity that can have brain states, again, all brain activity the way we're familiar with brain activity, without the corresponding or correlating mental states. And if you think that this is more plausible, then the same conclusion can still apply. So my question to you is, well, what would it look like, right, to have mental states without correlating brain states? Or perhaps we can switch these around, think, what would it look like to have brain states without correlating mental states? So I will leave that exercise to you, and that's all I have for this video.